Welcome to another episode of Critical Weight Theory, and this is my show within a show that I call Reply To, where I respond to people's comments that they made on my YouTube videos that are related to my podcast. So, Louis Samuel 9189 commented on a video. History and economic teachers here. Economically speaking, Obamacare is the closest thing in this country we have to fascism. Let me explain. Communism is when the government takes over the means of production. So, okay, I have to stop right there because, technically that's not the definition of communism. Just to be clear, communism is actually a classless and stateless society. So even if you are a Marxist communist who believes in state communism or something like that, that is supposed to be like a transitional phase if you are, a traditional Marxist communist. The Communist Manifesto even makes it clear that at some point the state is supposed to just wither away. So technically, this is not a correct definition of what communism is. It's not just government taking over the means of production. And in fact, if you really look at how the economic system functions and how the government functions, they often go hand in hand anyway, because in the United States, you have a lot of corporations that have largely taken control over the US government. So there's sort of I guess you could say, an open door that goes from business into government and from government into business. So the idea of the government merging with business, that's not necessarily a communist thing. Um, just to be clear about that. Anyway, the quote continues. Uh, Louis Samuel says fascism is when there can be private ownership of business, but those businesses are told what to produce and what the product will be. Con- uh, Continuing here in this response, Louis Samuel says businesses are allowed to make a profit as long as they offer what the government tells them to offer. With Obamacare, it is true you must have insurance or pay a fine. Insurance companies were told what exactly the product will be, and those were defined as the bronze, silver, or gold plan. If going by everything within the state, nothing outside the state, economically speaking, Obamacare is the closest thing in the country we have to fascism. So there's a little bit of repetition in this response. But anyway, going on with the rest of the comment. I'm looking forward to your childish and absolutely ignorant comment about how you feel bad for my students. However, I will be excited if I see an actual mature intellectual response. So that's the end of the YouTube comment. So obviously, this person is making assumptions about, how childish and absolutely ignorant my comment will be. So I'm going to try to not disappoint this person. I'm going to be as childish and ignorant as I can. And I do feel bad for this person's students, and not just because of this comment that this person made, but just because they're students in school, and school kind of sucks a little bit. So there's a bit of a general disappointment that I had with going to school, even though I had some good moments and some good memories, and I did learn a few things, including some basic things, but it seems like I could have learned a lot of that stuff without a lot of the sheer embarrassment that actually going to school entailed. But anyway, maybe that's neither here nor there. Let's get to the meat of the question that this person was, you know, bringing up here. So the argument that this comment makes, it sounds confident, but it relies on a shaky definition of fascism and a misunderstanding of how the Affordable Care Act actually works. So, for starters, the definition of fascism is wrong or at best incomplete. fascism is not simply private ownership with government rules. That definition is so broad, it would make nearly every modern economy fascist. And I suppose you could, because fascist is actually a relative term in some ways, you could actually, look at individual aspects of a given economy and say, this is relatively fascist and this is relatively not fascist, or whatever. But it kind of becomes an absurd thing to do at a certain point, because really you could point out that anything is fascist if you're defining it that broadly as, the private ownership with government rules thing. Historically, fascism includes authoritarian one party rule, suppression of political opposition and civil liberties, nationalism enforced through state power, corporatism, where industries are formally integrated into the state's political structure and serve its ideological goals. So, that would actually be one of the areas where you might argue that state communism and fascism have some elements in common. There's the integration of the state's political structure with industry, and they're channeled through certain ideological goals. But the ideological goals are at least supposed to be different. All right, they're supposed to be at least substantially different. So Italy under Mussolini did not just regulate industries, the state directly coordinated labor, production, and pricing through compulsory syndicates. Independent unions were banned, dissent was punished, and none of that describes the US healthcare system under the Affordable Care Act. Obviously, I mean it's not it's not quite like that. So if government sets rules for private businesses equals fascism, then food safety laws, building codes, aviation standards, Medicare, and public utilities would all qualify as well. And that kind of empties the word of meaning. If you apply the term that broadly, then pretty much everything that happens in an economy is fascistic if there's just some regulation going on. So again, I think that renders the word pretty much meaningless. Uh, Point number two, regulation is not the same thing as control of production. So under Obamacare, the government does not own insurance companies. It does not set prices. It does not dictate how much insurers can earn. It does not tell insurers how many policies to sell or to whom, beyond non discrimination rules. Those are actually in effect. What it does is set minimum standards for insurance products, similar to how the government defines what counts as safe, food, or a road legal car, or something like that. Insurers are still free to design plans, compete, advertise, profit, and exit the market, and many did exactly that. So calling this fascism confuses regulation of a market with command of a market. They're technically different things. And point number three, product standards are not telling businesses what to produce uh, in a fascist sense. So the bronze, silver, and gold tiers do not dictate specific products, they define actuarial value ranges. So insurers decide networks, deductibles, co-pays, provider contracts, and pricing, all that kind of stuff. So this is closer to nutritional labeling than industrial planning. Saying your insurance must cover basic health care is not the same as saying product X units of steel, or I mean, produce X units of steel for the glory of the state. Those are different things. So if the original logic of this person's comment held, then the FDA defining what qualifies as medicine or the EPA setting emissions limits would also be fascist. That conclusion is absurd to me because, you know, I don't think fascism is just saying that, aspirin is a medicine or something like that, and having the government being involved in that. Now, again, you might criticize uh, a thing like that the government has the ability to do those things, but it is definitely a bit of a stretch to say that it is inherently a fascistic thing to do. In fact, I mean, you could basically argue that in some ways it might be the opposite of fascism, because it would be showing that the government actually cares about the quality of medicine and stuff like that, and a sort of stereotypical fascist government would not necessarily care about that sort of distinction, um, because the ideology maintains that the dear leader at the top gets to decide those things. It would be more overtly authoritarian for the government to make uh, a just careless decision without caring about the science or the reasoning involved. Just follow what the dictator at the top says and everything will be fine. Now, that is in some ways actually more stereotypically fascistic. So, point number four, the individual mandate is not unique or authoritarian, uh, or particularly authoritarian. The mandate was modeled on state auto insurance requirements and Massachusetts bipartisan healthcare reform under Republican Mitt Romney. So, yes, it was originally a conservative idea meant to preserve private markets by preventing free riders. People could choose among private insurers or pay a tax penalty. That is not, coercive production, it's market stabilization, at least from the argument of the proponents of Obamacare. And notably, the mandate penalty has since been reduced to zero, yet the ACA framework remains. So it actually wasn't totally dependent on the supposedly demonic mandate. So if this were truly fascist control, removing the mandate would have collapsed the system. Keep that in mind. So, point number five about this comment of fascism is about power, not so much about paperwork. Fascism is enforced through repression, not actuarial tables. No one was jailed for refusing ACA coverage, at least not to my knowledge. If you can find an example, go ahead and let me know. No political parties were banned. No insurers were nationalized or forced into state syndicates. Courts repeatedly reviewed and limited the law. So there was actually some legal restrictions on it that did not just come from the dear leader at the top. So equating Obamacare with fascism trivializes actual fascist regimes and turns the term into a rhetorical insult rather than a decent analytical category. Obamacare is a regulated market with private actors, not state directed corporatism exactly. Uh, you might say there are elements of it, and you might make that argument, but it's not exactly sheer fascism or whatever. So it fits comfortably within the tradition of mixed economies that every developed democracy has operated under for decades. Now, I personally would prefer just universal health care coverage actually done through the government, like other societies in the industrialized world tend to do. Like we're one of the few countries that doesn't do things that way. And it's not that I love the government so much. That's not the point. It's just that they produce better outcomes than the for-profit health insurance does. You pay more under our system and you tend to get less. And I know one of the common arguments that's almost like a con sort of argument is that in a lot of countries you have to wait in long lines and stuff like that. But that seems to have more to do with like a shortage of doctors than anything else. Um, there's no inherent need to have long lines in a country. I don't think that universal health uh, care systems would actually require that in any way. It's just probably a consequence of certain policies not producing enough doctors. That seems what the issue what the issue is to me. I don't know. And plus, you can still have long wait times in the United States anyway. So that argument has never really been that compelling to me. And really, it's just an argument to, I guess, improve our education system to encourage more people to get into medicine and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, that would be really one of the main arguments I would make when it comes to that sort of thing. So, calling it the closest thing, calling Obamacare the closest thing we have to fascism says more about ideological frustration than about history or economics, at least to me.